So I'll say that again, I'll repeat that when you start with a motif and you put it into one of the patterns that I've explained to you are available, you don't know what will happen. The motif, when put with itself into one of the systems, such as a spiral or a mandala or geometric progression, becomes something else. It actually forms its own entity that looks quite different than the original motif. So this demonstration is just about creating a color blend that then you can make into or select from to make a palette, a personal palette that you would use then to apply to the pattern, and then how to apply it. That's what this demonstration is about. So first of all, notice that the one module here looks quite different than when it's repeated into a group of 9 of them. So that's the first thing to remark upon. Then I also want to say that this person used a grid. So in Illustrator, I'm showing you in Illustrator, but you could also do this in Photoshop if you're a lot more comfortable in Photoshop, but it's a whole different kind of filling process. We did some of that in Project 2. So those of you who are really good at Photoshop may end up doing some of it in Photoshop. In any case, right now I'm working in Illustrator, and I just want to show you that the grid is up. This person felt it was easier for them to work when the grid was up, but you can put it away by going to View and then say Hide Grid. So that might make it a little bit clearer when I demonstrate now. I'm going to create a blend in Illustrator. So I'm going to start with a square and color it. I'll just use my swatches palette. And so going down to swatches, I'm going to bring it up and put it in tabs so that you can see it. And I'll start with yellow, a yellow color. So there's my yellow, and I'm going to copy this over. So Option or Alt on the PC, and copy it over so that you have another one of the same. And you could align them even when you work in Illustrator. If you select 2 objects, the Align command comes up, and you can align them just so that your swatches look better when you do the blend. You can align them to their top or their bottom. And then you go into the blend tool, which is a little black square going to a little white circle in the front. It's right next to the eyedropper or right under the eyedropper if you're in single column. And double click on the blend tool so that you bring up the blend options. You want to change smooth color to specified steps. And then decide how many you'd like to choose from. In the case, well, for us, we did the color theory project with 11. Remember, we did 11. So choose 11 or 9 in between, and say okay. And then you will choose another color. Whoops, I forgot to do that. You want this to be, complement. So I'm going to click away for a minute and just select the right one and choose a complement. Let's say violet. And I think these will be okay. If it's not the right violet, you'll see, because the middle swatch should be what? If these are complementary, the middle swatch should be neutral, right? So go back to the blend tool. I think it retained the preferences that I just put it in. Yes, it still specifies steps in 9. So I say, okay, I'm using the blend tool and I click on one and then click on the other. Now, if this isn't neutral enough, notice that it's a little bit reddish. And I don't really want a stroke on it. You don't need that stroke. And so I'm going to say no. Go to the stroke box and say none. So it's a little bit reddish in the middle. So what do I need to do? This is a primary, so you can't do anything to the yellow because it's primary. So I'm going to go with the white selection tool, which allows me to select within a group. I'm going to go to the violet, and I'm going to take some of the red out. And so it needs to be a little bit more of a blue violet. And in order to do that, I have to get my color palette. I go to window, I'm looking for the color. It's already up somewhere. I'm looking for it, I don't quite see it. So here's my color palette. There it is, it's down here under the Zoom program makes it so that I have a little trouble having everything on the screen at the same time. So in my color palette, I can take my white selection tool and select the end box. The white selection tool will let me do this, but the black one will not. The black one will select the whole blend that's still grouped. So you want to go to this color and take out a little bit of the red. So it's magenta. I need to take out a tiny bit. Now watch. As I take out the red, the whole blend changes because it's still a group. So now it looks better to me. These two look like a lot more neutral. So I leave this color and I say, I'm going to set up a color palette from this group. So I'm going to now I can select this blend just by clicking on it, and it's a blended group. And remember in our color theory project, we said object, expand, and just say okay to both of those, to the defaults, and then say object, ungroup. And now you can use these, you can pull from them and decide what your color palette in terms of filling this thing should be. Now I'm doing the complementary one. When you do the analogous one, it would be the same thing. When you do the monochromatic blend, when you make your monochromatic palette, you probably want to go take one from your color project, those files, remember? So you made some monochromatic, you did it with CMY, but you don't have to use the primaries. You could use any color and do a monochromatic blend. You go from the color to white and the color to black. And remember how we did it? We had to, one of the steps, we had to do the object expand, object group, ungroup, because otherwise it wouldn't let us do the whole blend. When you do your triadic colors, you're just going to choose 3 colors from the color wheel, and you're going to go back to your color wheel and find that triangle. So in this case, I've done a complementary blend, and now I want to decide the colors that I'm going to use in this. So I'm going to move this, and you know, it was grouped before, but it's not grouped now, so I had to select all of it. I'm going to move it up a bit. And now I'm going to pick the colors that I want to use when I apply it to this, pattern. So I'm going to hold Option or Alt on the PC and just pull some of these colors down, the ones that I think I might want to use. So I'm making copies of them, so I leave my blend alone. And maybe I want to use the end color also. So, so now I have my 5 colors. I'm going to change this to a, can you see? Can you all see this? I could change, the background to a different color if it helps you see it. Here, I'll go into the Illustrator preferences and change the background. Yeah, that's a little better, I guess. I like it lighter rather than darker, but you people probably like it darker because you're used to that. Any case, so these are the colors I'm going to use. Now, I said that you could either make tints or shades. So there might be situations where you want a really dark color, but I said that you could not use white or black in this project. It all has to be about color. So you can go to this color, for instance, and the way you make something lighter in Illustrator and Photoshop is just by diminishing all of these, but don't subtract the same number from all of them because it would change the proportions of the color. It won't be the same color anymore. What you should do is take a percentage and subtract it. So like 10% of 7.5 is 0.75. So you could subtract like 1 from this, 1 from, but the easier way is to use in Illustrator to use the color guide. There is no color guide in Photoshop, so it's a little bit more difficult. You'd actually have to mix the color yourself. But in Illustrator, and that's why it's really good to do this project in Illustrator, there's a lot of useful tools for this. Here's the key color, and if you click on it, that was the same color as I showed you right here. You have tints and shades of that color. It's not the same thing as we did when we did the chromatic value scale, because they just put the color right in the middle. That is not what we did. We put the color at the correct place, so it would have been over here. But here it gives you many tints and many shades of the same color, 5 of shades and 5 tints, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 tints and 4 shades. So like if I decided I wanted a tint of this color, but I still want to use this color, I hold Option, make a copy of it, go to the color guide, and choose maybe the lightest tint of that color. And then let's say I want to have a very, very dark violet in my piece as well. So Option, and then you can just add black, or you can go back to the color guide and notice that my key color is on the top left of the color guide, and go to the darkest value of that color. Does that make sense? So that you could use a very light and a very dark, because Miss Khan, that's me, said that you can't use white and black in this project, but you could use very, very dark or very light. So now I'm going to fill. And what would be the best way to fill this? Well, it won't let me fill these shapes because she didn't make them, or he didn't make them as shapes. He made them with lines. So if you did something like this, you're going to have to either take it into Photoshop and use the magic wand tool to select areas. And that's pretty easy. We did that when we did the second project, remember? Or in Illustrator, you can do something called live paint. And the live paint function depends on there being, the same as Photoshop, an area that's surrounded by a black line or a dark line. So if you don't, and it also, you can't do it if it's on different layers. It has to be, I think, on the same layer. I'm not sure about that anymore because they've changed it. So these are all different segments. So the program, and I also put a black line, I put a black stroke around the whole thing. So these aren't open shapes anymore because it won't like that. It won't be able to fill those areas. So to do live paint on it, I have to select the whole thing. And now it's different segments. She made these as 1 segment, 2 segment, 3 segment, notice? So will it let me? So I'll go Object, Live Paint, and it's not available. So basically it's not available because they're all different sections and it doesn't like that. So I'm gonna have to live trace it. I'm gonna have to trace it first and then paint it. So how do you do that? Well, you have to rasterize it. So I'm going to go and say Object. I'll click away so I can, I think it'll let me if I, oh no, I guess I do have to select the whole thing. And then say Object, Image Trace. Oh no, I have to rasterize it first, rasterize. And you want to rasterize it transparent, not white. And say okay. Then select it again. It's selected the whole thing. I click on it and it selects the whole thing and say Object, let's see what happens. And see if I can do it now, Live Paint. I still can't do it, I have to trace it. So I'm gonna say Make and Expand. Now perhaps it will let me do it. So let's see, Object. And you may have to, you know, get Matthew or me to help you do this. You might have to be in touch with me when you're doing it if you're trying to do it, or you might have to get a friend to help you. So now notice Live Paint is available to me. So I can do Live Paint, Make. Well, I might want to, okay, Make. And what happens is the Live Paint bucket now becomes available for me to use, but I have to click away first. And then I'm going to start filling with these colors using the Live Paint bucket, which is, by the way, in with the Shape Builder tool. So it's the Shape Builder tool, the Live Paint bucket, and the Live Paint selection tool. So with the Live Paint bucket, you can hover above things and everything becomes fillable. Notice. So that's one way. If you haven't created every object as an object, now, you know, you could have, each one of these could have been objects that you created and then put together. But often that's not how you did it. Like there's shapes in it that you did with just line or, you know, so they're not whole shapes. So in this case, I had to create, I had to trace it, I had to rasterize it, then I had to trace it, then I had to live paint it. And I happen to know enough about these programs that I kind of put myself through these steps, but often I had to really play with it before I could get it to be a live paint, you know, that I could do the live paint function to it. So you may have to ask one of us for help when you try to fill it. If you had brought it into Photoshop, it would have been rasterized by just simply you're bringing it into Photoshop. Now, when we did this project before, when you bring something into Photoshop, remember that you have to keep it at a high resolution in order to ever have any hope of printing it. We're not necessarily printing it this time. You may want to print it in the future. So when you bring it into Photoshop, keep it at a resolution of 200. It'll ask you, what do you want to bring? How do you want to bring this into Photoshop? And, you know, maybe keep it at 200 so that you could print it in the future. So now I can fill. So I choose my color. And to do that, you have to use the eyedropper tool. So go to the eyedropper tool and say, maybe every part, this on the right side of the flower is always going to be a yellow color. So I make the fill yellow, then I go to my paint bucket tool and I find that particular shape and I'm going to make it yellow. And every single one, or maybe I'll make these, every other one yellow. So in this row, I'm going to do it this way. So you can play with the organization of how you do this. And I'll work on this and show you. You can just go through it. Now, maybe these background colors I want to be violet. I'll do just the, so this one, whoops, I messed up here. It's going to be that, so it's actually not. I have to, this one, I have to make it white again. I'll do that in a minute. Whoops, yeah, actually. So these two have to be white. So go back to my live paint bucket or the paint bucket. Anyway, something like that. Then I'm going to start with the round. I just want to show you that you can do it with larger areas also. So let's say I decide on, in one row, I'm going to have this color. I'm going to work with violets here. I'm going to work with a, this color violet as a background for some of them, and then the really dark color also. So this is just by way of a demonstration. So I'm going to make, whoops, I'm on the wrong tool, the paint bucket. And then I'll go to the really dark one, or maybe, yeah. And so forth until I have the whole pattern filled. So each one of these shapes became fillable with this method. You know that a shape is fillable when it has that little red line. So you kind of have to wait until you get the red line in that particular shape, and then it's fillable. Now this is one way of doing it. Another way would be to make all your shapes complete shapes, you know, that you've drawn them as whole shapes so that you could actually fill them. Then you don't have to do any, you don't have to do the live paint function to it at all. They're all fillable shapes because you drew them that way. But if you drew it with line and you put it together, it's not going to be fillable. The other thing, as I said, is at the very end, when you have something you like, that's going to be your final, or a good part of your final piece, you can bring it back into Illustrator as segments and put it back together and take it back and forth, put it back in Photoshop, because you need to create segments that you're going to put together as a pattern. So you can go back and forth between Illustrator and Photoshop, but remember that when you take it into Photoshop, it rasterizes it. You could keep it as a smart object if you know what you're doing, and then bring it back into Illustrator that way, and it may maintain its vector characteristics enough to fill it. I'm not sure. So filling it is a bit of a challenge. You know, putting color in it is a bit of a challenge. But you must, the requirements for this project is that you create from a blend 3 color palettes, and then with the triadic ones, you're not going to do a blend. You're just going to select them on the color wheel, 3 different colors, and then you can use tints and shades of those 3 different colors. But the monochromatic, the complementary, and the analogous will all be done with the blend tool in Illustrator. And you can bring these into Photoshop by expanding the Photoshop canvas size and then putting them at the bottom that way that you can crop out later. But in Photoshop, you don't have a clipboard like this. There's no board that you can put things on. Anything that's outside of the canvas, you don't see and you can't use. So in Photoshop, the only way to do it is to go to Image, Canvas, and expand the canvas by a few inches, where you can then paste them into Photoshop and use these. I don't know if I've shown you that. I showed my other class because they're photographers and they need to expand their canvas size in order to use, they're going to do it in Photoshop. So they have to glue these blends and swatches, or at least the swatches. They don't really need to do this if they don't want to. They need to have their final swatches that they took from the blend and bring it into Photoshop and use it in Photoshop. Does that make sense? Please ask some questions at this point. Anyone, ask me a question.
How many, did you say how many colors we should pick from the swatches, from the swatch?
That's Roxanne, right?
Yeah.
I think you should use at least, let's say, well, when you pick from the swatch blend, how many to use? And then,
yeah.
And you're going to make tints and shades too, or what? Like just from the swatches, how many you should pick from here?
Yeah, how many from the swatch itself?
At least 3, but probably 5. And then you can make some tints and shades also. So I picked, this is a tint and that's a shade. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I would say 5. It depends a little on your pattern. I mean, if it's very, very simple, maybe you can start with 3 and make a bunch of tints and shades. But I would say 5. I think 5 is the best to pick. Then you'll have enough. Some people had 7, and then they made some tints and shades because they needed them. They needed to go lighter and darker.
Okay, yeah.
So I want to see, if you're doing it in Illustrator, I want to see if you know your swatches. And if you do it in Photoshop, expand your canvas for your color studies and put the swatches that you're using at the bottom or the top, whatever you prefer. I want to see your work. And then for your final piece, you might be gluing some of these together. Maybe you want a long horizontal one, so you put 2 or 3 of these together horizontally. So you have to make a new document the size that you want. It doesn't have to be square, especially since we're not even printing it now. It can really be any dimensions that you want. But don't make it gigantic because you won't be able to print it later. And what if you want to? So make it, I said on the project sheet, keep it to perhaps something like 12 by 15 or 12 by 16 inches. But it could be longer. I mean, you could print it then on a much bigger paper if you wanted it to be 12 by 24. It would be an interesting, like scroll type thing. You know, it could be an interesting size now that we're not going to print it. Also, I would take, if you're working in Illustrator, I would take the stroke off. I don't really like strokes all that much. So I would either work with the stroke as something independent of your shapes. So some of the stroke is left and some of it's taken off. That would be nice. Or at the very end, take the stroke off. So all you have to do in that case, if it's still an Illustrator, is go into it and say no stroke. Now in this case, unfortunately, I rasterize it. So that stroke is going to be there. And you could, yeah, because I've rasterized it, the stroke pretty much has to stay. But you could have changed the color of the stroke before. I mean, if it's still an Illustrator, I think it's really fun to work with the stroke also and make the stroke more apparent or wider than one point, which is so boring. And then take it off some other objects. I think most people who did really successful end pieces took the stroke off some of it, because it's just, to have a 1-point stroke is so boring. A 1-point black stroke, how mundane. So, you know, take that off. But yeah, I mean, you might have to go backwards at some point. Once you get it how you want it, you might have to go backwards and say, I need to at some point do another something else. So this is quite time consuming, this project. That's why I would not use too many motifs, even if you're doing a mandala, and would not do too many complex things, because you have to fill it with color, and that's a whole nother process. Let me show you another one that I did. I'm going to just say save onto the desktop right now, just so I could go back to this if I want. So I'm going to say save, and line demo flower, I'll say 2 or something, and save. Now here's another one that I actually did from scratch last year, and I was looking for it, and I'd already put it on the desktop. So here it is. So I did this for my other class. So I started here, the files, they're Illustrator files, so I can pull it into Illustrator. And I am suggesting that you do this in Illustrator. I think it's a project that lends itself to Illustrator because it's easy to multiply or to replicate things in Illustrator, right? You just hold Option and pull, and then it's easy to rotate things. You can go Object, and it's Object, Transform. You can do a lot of things in Illustrator that are much easier than Photoshop. It's a vector program. You can do that live paint function if you want, just to a group of things. You don't even have to do it to the whole thing. But here's one that I did last year as a demo. And I just started from scratch. So I made this line that was kind of calligraphic. Here was my motif. It was super simple, right? But it had that sort of calligraphic line. And I then multiplied it, put it inside a square. Seems to be a little frozen. Okay. There, it wouldn't come up. So this was what I did with that motif, and I started coloring it, and I used the same blend that I showed you. So it was a complementary blend with neutrals. So I then made another 4 of them together. And then I said, what system am I going to use? And instead of using the grid system, I used the golden rectangle. So here's the golden rectangle with that motif, with that group in it. So here's the golden rectangle. I made it up. I actually didn't have a rectangle, so I kind of made it up and I measured it. So this was 1.6 and this was 1. So it didn't work perfectly because I had made it up and I tried to do it as best I could, but I actually measured it out. So here's what I started with. And then I rotated them every time as I moved around. So this is rotated once, notice. And then what it is the golden rectangle is a square and a leftover rectangle. And the leftover rectangle is just another golden rectangle. So you can put this, and then you have this leftover. And then you have this, and then you have this leftover. And you just keep moving inside. But you might as well get it off the internet, the exact rectangle, so that it works when you use it. Because I actually just measured. I had a 1.6 measurement and then I just took 1. You know, I made it myself. It wasn't exact, so it didn't work so exactly. Take it from the internet, take the golden rectangle from the internet so you have the exact right measurement. Anyway, I rotated it every time I moved around, and this is actually pretty interesting looking. So I'm also interested in your working with the negatives. So see what happens when you put your motif into your system. You should get some pretty interesting negative shapes. I want you to be paying attention to the negative shapes. Another question. That was a good question, Roxanne. You don't have to stick to just normal, everyday colors. I really like these neutrals that happened, so I was using them. When you do your analogous blend, you could do tints and shades, very, very interesting, you know, tints and shades of your analogous colors. You don't have to just stick to, you know, like if you're doing complementary colors, you don't have to just use obviously the yellow and the violet. All the things in between and tints and shades you can use. But stick to the complementary blend. You can't go outside that, but you can do tints and shades of all of those colors. It gives you pretty much an infinite selection within that system. So you're going to do a monochromatic, a complementary, an analogous, and a triadic. And that's what is going to occupy you. I think for next time, I want you to figure it out, part B, and start to maybe and do one of the color applications. So when you do part B, you're just setting up maybe several repetitions. You're looking ahead to say, well, what is my final piece maybe going to look like? So you try the color on just like 3 or 4 repetitions within your system. In this case, this might be my final piece. So I would do this over again in the 4 different color systems. And that would be my final, and then pick one as your favorite. And then you're going to show us what you did.
When we're coloring in our shapes, is it okay to use gradients instead of just flat colors?
Yes,
Okay.
but you have to use the gradients within those colors. You can only make out of those colors.
Yeah, okay.
And it seems like it gets a little bit more complicated. So if you're good in the program, I think you could do that. But if you're not, you might not want to attempt it.
Well, it'll just like maybe for some instances, maybe not the shape itself, but like the negative space, what would be the background.
Might be good as a gradient.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Definitely.
Okay.
Fine.
Thank you.
Absolutely fine. Anybody else? Any question? I mean, really anything goes. You can work with sizes. You could use the Fibonacci series to control the sizes of things, to control the layers, to control how many replications you have. You could use, you could do a mandala that just is a personal mandala that has to do with your personal belief or spirituality or religion. Really, it's the idea of this is that you have to repeat your motif in some way. So how are you going to do it?